What I'm going to do this morning over the next hour is show you a really nice scene that has been created by our art department, which really demonstrates the power of X-particle simulations and the beauty of the renders that you get with Cycles 4D. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down some of these techniques for you live so you can see how relatively simple it is to get some motion graphics and visual effects work that looks absolutely stunning, that looks like a whole team of artists have probably worked on it, but actually you're able to do it even as just an independent freelancer on your own. So here is a short animation, a stunning animation with this neon city look. So I'll play this one first before we go into the depth. So there's quite a lot going on in this animation. It's very short. We've got this striking neon city look, and there's loads of complex visual effects concepts going on in what is kind of a motion graphic scene. So first of all, we've got this really nice fluid splash, but if you can see, we've also got this kind of MoGraphy cubed, rippling floor, which is dynamic. So when the splash hits the floor, we get this ripple effect, and we've got these nice kind of shiny MoGraph-style cubes rippling along. We've got things like spline dynamics. Here we've got some explosions and particle advection. Here we can see, look, the splines are being moved and advected with this, and then we've got this procedural organic growth of the city lights spreading on as the explosion hits. So there's an awful lot of techniques in there. And what this demonstrates is that with X-particles, all of the tools that we have, they're all coherent, they all work together. So you don't do a fluid sim and an explosion sim separately and then comp it all together in post. Everything can be done at the simulation time. Everything talks to each other. So the animations are always really coherent because they're all from the same kind of ecosystem. So the first thing we're going to break down is I'm going to recreate this splash with a dynamic floor scene for you, which will demonstrate the ease of which we can bring these quite complex visual effects techniques to motion graphics scenes. So here we are inside Maxon's Cinema 4D, and here we have just a Cinema 4D plane object, and this is going to be our floor. And the way we get normal Cinema 4D objects to interact with X-particles is we've got a tag system. So on this plane, we want this plane to be our floor. So we're going to go to tags, X-particles tags, and I've got collider. Just stick that on, and now this plane will interact with particles. They'll bounce off it. So I'm going to bring in an X-particles system. So this system is like an organizational hierarchy here where we store all of our X-particles objects, physics solvers, modifiers, and it keeps them in a really organized fashion, which is obviously really important if you're sharing scenes with other artists. They have to be able to read your scenes. So the system does that. And what happens by default is we are brought in an X-particles emitter, and the default emitter is this square, and it spits out green particles on the z-axis. Okay? So this is going to be the start of our splash. Instead of it being this square, we're going to change it to being a spherical shape. It's going to make it a bit smaller. And now you'll see that those particles, let me just change the display of those so you can see them a bit better. We'll change it to squares. There you go. So now we've got particles spitting off like this. Let's move that down. And you'll see them bouncing off the floor? That's because we've got the collider tag on. So now we can start bringing some real-world forces into this to make it feel more realistic. We need a gravity. So we'll go to our modifiers list and bring in a motion modifier, and there's loads. We've got turbulence and vortex, wind, all kinds. But we've got gravity here. Bring it into the scene, and now the particles are falling to the ground. Fantastic. So now we want them to start behaving like fluid, because we're making a splash of water. So we need to tell these particles, you need to interact with each other as if you were fluid particles. So we do that with a dynamic object. So if I go into my dynamics menu, There's shed loads of dynamics objects. We've got explosions, we have got constraint systems, we've got force fields, we've got all kinds. But what we want is a fluid FX. So I'm just going to bring that in. And now it just needs to live in the scene. We don't need to connect it to anything. It just needs to be in the system. And now those particles are going to be behaving a little bit more like fluid. It's not quite right yet, but we're getting there. So let's increase the friction on our floor so they don't spread out as much. Cool. And now what we're going to do is we want this just to be one splat of particles. We don't want this constant stream. So we'll go to the emitter, to the emission tab, and instead of it being rate, so it just spits out these particles continuously, we are going to not emit all frames, we're going to end the emission on frame 1, so it just spits them out. And that looks pretty pathetic, doesn't it? So let's increase the amount by changing this emission mode, and now we've got a few more. Now, I won't go into the detail here, but I've used an emission mode called hexagonal, which has been designed to work brilliantly with fluids. And what this mode does, it gives you a perfectly stable starting point with your particles to then do a fluid simulation. So let's have a look. We want these particles to be spitting downwards. At the moment, they're going in the normals direction of that sphere. So let's just say we want them to go down on the -y axis. All right. So it's still not looking very splash-like, is it? But we're edging ever closer. So now what we want to do is put a load of force, a load of energy into this scene. So what I'm going to do is go to the emission tab of the emitter, which is where you control how the particles behave, and I'm going to put the initial speed way up from 150, way up to 2,000. So now we're getting a little bit of an initial splash. We're starting to get the shape that we want. Great. What I'm going to do is go to my gravity modifier, and I can just reduce the strength of that gravity so it's not pulling down quite as ferociously. And now let's have a look. Now we're getting a bit of a splash. It looks nothing like a fluid, but we've got the shape. So this is the really cool bit now. We have got this quite low particle count splash, but to get it to look like a proper fluid splash, we need to fill in these gaps because we've just got sparse particles all over. Whereas if we were able to fill in the gap, we would start getting sheets of water and tendrils splashing up. So the way we do that is it's really simple. We go to dynamics, and there's another dynamic object called the XP sheeter. Let's bring that in. And this is really clever. What it does, it analyzes two fluid particles, and it analyzes how they're moving away from each other. And if they're moving away from each other in a way that satisfies the various different settings, the threshold settings you put in, it spawns new particles in the gaps. So if I just hit play on the default settings, we might not get any new particles. We might. Let's just have a look. I think we've got a few more just here where my mouse cursor is, but not many. So let's create some more. I'm going to increase the maximum fluid density it's searching for, which will start sheeting more particles. Look at this big tendril that's appeared here now. And now we're starting to get a splash. Let's increase that a little bit more. And there we go, we're starting to get what looks like a splash. So now we've got loads more particles. I'm just going to turn the display of them back from squares to dots so we can just see a little bit more detail. And there we go. So there is our splash. So we've gone from what looked like just a splat of individual particles to a cohesive splash, like crown splash. And if we look at it from above, you can really see that it's got that splat effect. Now, before the things like fluid effects and XP sheeter existed, it was really difficult to get that type of splash effect. It would take, a week of simulating a very powerful machine. But now we're able to do it in minutes, which is great. So to take this from just being particles to actually something that we can render, we need to change those particles into a mesh, into a polygon object. And that, again, is really simple. we just go to generators, because we want to generate a mesh. And in here, we're going to pick our XP OpenVDB mesher. And this is brilliant, because you can mesh almost anything with this. You can mesh trails, you can mesh any Cinema 4D objects, you can mesh clones, you can mesh particles, you can even mesh smoke and fire simulations and turn them into a polygon object. So what we need to do, what it asks for, the mesher asks for a source object. What do you want to mesh? We want to mesh our fluid particles. So what we do is just drag in the emitter. Let's drag that in. And look, if I just get rid of those lines, we have a very blobby looking mesh. So it's obviously not right yet, but you can see how it works. It's creating a mesh around every particle, and where those particles join, it kind of creates this contiguous mesh. And this updates frame by frame, so it's really smart. So what we need to do to make this look a bit more realistic and detailed and less blobby is in our OpenVDB mesher settings, there's only 2 settings we need to concentrate on when doing particles. The point radius, if I bring this point radius down, you'll see that the blobbiness reduces. You see it coming in on itself? So now it's getting a bit more detailed. So the point radius dictates how the radius around each particle. And then we've got this voxel size. And the voxel size dictates the size of these polygons. So the lower the voxel size, the more detailed the mesh, the more polygons that you have. Obviously, it takes longer to simulate when you start putting in lots more polygons. But what you end up doing is pushing and pulling on these 2 parameters until you're getting a look that you like. So once you've got kind of the look, we then want to start filtering this to make it look a little bit more smooth. So we do this, we've got a filters tab, and if I just activate filters, did you see it's smoothened out a little bit because we've got our default median filter here. And the default median filter is a really good one for fluids because it smooths out the majority of the mesh, but it keeps a little bit of the blobbiness. And that blobbiness is quite important. When we put a highly transparent, reflective and refractive material on here, you need a little bit of blobbiness in there to get the detail of that fluid surface out. Otherwise, it just doesn't look realistic. So that's great. And then if you want to, once we've got the thinning, I mean, look, if I just get rid of that median and bring in the Gaussian, which is the smoothest filter, it'll go really smooth. So that's much more aggressive. But I prefer the median. And then once you've got the look that you like, we can use what's called an offset filter, which kind of brings the mesh in on itself. You see, it's like thinning it down, but retaining the detail. And now we're starting to get a really fine looking fluid mesh. So that's very cool. So very quickly, in 15 minutes, we've made quite a detailed fluid splash. We've meshed it. This is ready for render time, which I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. Let's just have a quick look back at this render. So we've done our splash, and if you notice, I mentioned at the beginning, when this water hits the ground, we have got this shock wave kind of rippling of the floor, and it parts. So we're going to get that set up now. We're going to make this dynamic. So what we want to do is make this plane a dynamic object, so when the fluid particles hit it, it starts to ripple and bend. So the way in which we're going to do that is this. We need to take our plane and we can apply an X-particles dynamic system to it. But we also need it to be a collider because we want the fluid particles to bounce off it, and we can't do both. But here's the trick. What we do is we get the Cinema 4D connect object, which connects objects cleverly, and we're going to put the plane inside there. And this is the clever bit. We're going to put the collider tag on the connect object, so that's going to handle the fluid splash bouncing off the floor. And on the plane, we're going to make the plane dynamic. And we do that by going to tags, X-particles tags, dynamics. Click that on. I'm going to go forward 1 frame. Now, can you see that it has spawned a new particle, if I reveal the lines, on every vertex point of our plane. You see there's a particle there? So what's going to happen with these particles is they're going to be affected by anything that we put in the scene, gravity, turbulence, and they'll move around, and then they will make the plane deform with the shape of those particles because they're locked to the vertices. So that's the principle. But there's a couple of things that we need to do before we can get this wavy floor to work. Because we don't want these new dynamic particles to be affected by the gravity. Because otherwise the plane's just going to fall away forever and it's not going to be there to bounce off our splash. So we need to exclude them from the gravity. We also need to exclude them from the sheeter, this object that's making new particles. Otherwise we might spawn a load of new dynamic particles that we don't need. So what we can do, by default, it just spawns these particles on its own. You don't have to do anything. But what you can do for more control in the dynamics tag is add an emitter. And if we add an emitter, it makes a new emitter in your scene. Let's just rename it Emitter Dynamics. And now we've got full control over those dynamic particles with all of the emitter settings. So what we can do, we want to exclude the gravity and the sheeter. So in the new emitter dynamics, we'll just go to modifiers. And look, we've got an exclude box. So I'm just going to drag in the sheeter. And I'm going to drag in the gravity. Now they've been excluded. We also don't want the dynamic particles to interact with our collider tag on the floor because they're part of the same floor and that's not going to work. So in our collider tag, we've got an exclusions tab and we can drag in our dynamic particles. So that's all set up. We're just about ready to go. So now we can adjust the dynamic settings to get our nice wobbly rippling floor. So I'm going to make the radius of those particles the same as our fluid ones. So if I hit play now, let's just deactivate the mesher so it runs a bit more quickly. If I hit play, there goes the splash. Now those splash particles should be interacting with that floor. And I don't know if you can see it on the screen, there is a tiny bit of rippling. Can you see how those polys have been distorted? So it is working, but admittedly it's a little underwhelming. And that's because it's just too rigid. We need to loosen up that floor and make it a really wobbly floor. So when the particles hit it, it has this kind of shockwave effect. So what we need to do, look, is reduce the rigidity way down so it's not a rigid floor. So this is going to help somewhat. But now we've made it so wobbly that you can see, look, they've all kind of distorted over the top of each other and it's lost its form. So it's kind of hard. We want a middle ground. We want it really wobbly, but we want it to hold its floor shape. And we do that really easily with constraints. And these are just spring, like imagine a spring between each dynamic particle and it can move and wobble, but it holds its shape. So I'm just going to click on constraints, press play, and there we go. If we come out, we're starting to get a dynamic ripple. And this isn't just happening on its own. If I make our splash particles visible again, only where the splash particles are hitting the dynamic particles, it is rippling and creating this dynamic floor, which means that the scene is perfectly coherent, which is awesome. And that's it. So obviously, this isn't good enough detail to render. This is a very low poly floor, and we're not actually going to be rendering this floor itself. But if you wanted to, you could. All you need to do is bring in a subdivision surface, put the connect inside that, and look, it's smoothed it out. If I hide the lines, now we've got a really nice, smooth, wrinkled floor, which is interacting with those particles. So that is easy done if you want to. Excellent. So we've got the base simulation now, okay? So let's just have a look at the video again. So what we need to do now, we need to turn this into this kind of MoGraph scene. We need to somehow spawn these cubes onto this dynamic floor. So to do that, what I'm going to do is open a different scene. So this is pretty much exactly the same, but I've just cached, baked down that animation that we've just seen. So this is now in memory. It's saved to disk. And if I go into my X-particle system, can you see these red tags? So these red tags say that this has been cached. That information has now been baked. It isn't having to work it out every time you scrub the playhead, which means that I can scrub backwards and forwards and we can see this sim and we can see our rippling floor. But it's exactly the same as what we just had. Great. So I'm just going to make the mesher invisible because we'll get faster playback. So this is the really powerful thing with X-particles. Everything we've done so far has been done just with X-particles. But it integrates perfectly with all of the Cinema 4D tools as well. So we have a baked X-particle system, and we are going to mix it with a live Cinema 4D MoGraph system, which will be procedural. And we can do both, which is really neat. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring a MoGraph matrix object in. So what this is, it's just like a cloner, but instead of it cloning geometry, it just creates these kind of cubed reference points. They're just points in 3D space. They don't render, they don't do anything, they're just a point in space. And what we're going to do, instead of spawning them in this grid, we're going to spawn them onto our floor. So let's go, we'll change the mode from grid to object. I'm going to drag in my connect, which is our floor object. I'll switch off that subdivision surface. Okay, now I don't know if you can see that, but now they've been spawned. You see them? They've been spawned randomly over the surface of our floor. So instead of that, we can change the distribution from surface to vertex, and now we have got one cube per vertex of our cached dynamic floor. So if I just make the emitter invisible, in fact, I can just switch that off, you can see that our matrix points are animating with our floor, which is really cool. And if I make the floor invisible, now we've just got, these are just our matrix points with our ripple. But these are still editable with all of the effectors. So look, this is, again, it's a cached scene, but if I go to MoGraph Effectors and use one of the old effectors here, we can manipulate these matrix points even though they're being driven by the X-particles. So if I just bring in, say, a formula effector, this formula effector is going to be using this sine wave to change the position and the scale. So watch. So we're able to change the position of those matrix points parametrically, procedurally, even though the ripple is being driven by an X-particles cached simulation, which is really, really cool. And of course, you can use all of the Cinema 4D tools here. So look, we could use a fall-off. So if I just bring in a spherical field, let's just make that a bit wider, and let's invert that field. So now, the effector is only happening outside the bounds of that field, and we're getting the initial ripple unaffected. So obviously, we don't want to use it in this instance, but it's a good way of demonstrating that we can keep what feels like a live procedural animation, even though we've got this cached X-particles base simulation. Let's get rid of that formula effector. Right, cool. So we've got our scene now. We've got our mesh, and we've got our dynamic floor. So let's have a look at rendering. So everything's been X-particles, but we also make Cycles 4D, which is a CPU and GPU path tracing render engine. And what are the really, I'm just going to change my layout to a Cycles 4D layout. So this is exactly the same scene, but we've just got some new windows. This is the real-time preview, where you're going to see a preview of the render. This is the node editor where you adjust your materials, and this is our viewport, and we've still got our object manager. So it's exactly the same scene. So what we're going to do is, look, let's make our mesh visible again. Okay. And we'll bring in a Cycles 4D environment, which means we're going to be able to light this with an HDRI image. So there we go, we've got something. So what we've got, if I just dolly in, there is our splash mesh, which is being lit by this rather uninspiring HDR of a dilapidated, air hockey room. But there we can see real-time rendering being lit by this HDRI. So let's put a material on. We want our splash to look like water. So I'm going to go to Cycles 4D. This is the material manager here where you make all your materials. I'm going to bring in a surface, and we've got all these presets, and there's a glass material. So I'm just going to click on that and drag that glass material onto the mesher, and instantly we've got a splash that looks pretty decent. And it's just one node, this glass material. It's got index of refraction. Let's change that to what water would be, 1.33. It's got a roughness slider, a color, and then a reflections model. And that's it. And just with the preset, we've got a good look. And what Cycles is fantastic for is two things. You can just use the basic preset shaders and materials, and you get really good results straight away with one simple node for people that aren't comfortable with, complex procedural material building. But then if you want to, you can dive in really deep and have hugely complex node trees, 200 nodes, making amazing procedural materials. So you can do both very easily. Cool, so let's change this now. Now we want to, we want to render those matrix points, and we can do that directly. All we need to do is put a material on. So we'll go to Cycles 4D, Surface, Glossy. So glossy is just like a reflective material. And I'm going to drag that onto my matrix object. And look, can you see what's happened? Just by default, Cycles has instanced a sphere, a glossy sphere, on every matrix point. But we want to be able to spawn a different object on there. We want cubes. And you can do this. You can spawn whatever object you want. All you have to do is we go to the matrix object, which we're rendering, and we'll go Tags, Cycles 4D tags, and we've got an instance tag, which allows us to instance any object in that position. So by default, it's spheres. But look, I'm going to get a Cinema 4D cube. Let's just make it quite small, 10 by 10 by 10. Okay? So in that instance tag, I'm going to drag in the cube to the objects. And now we're instancing cubes. I'm just going to put my material on the cube. So now we have got these shiny cubes. Let's change this HDRI because this image is awful. We'll go to the environment. This is another cool thing. In the environment object, we've got an HDR tab, and built in is an HDR browser. So if I click on there, it automatically opens up all of your HDRI libraries that are saved on your computer, and then you can search through and try different looks. So I've got this Manhattan Night Swan with some nice HDRIs, and the one we're going to choose is this Broadway, I think it's pronounced Lafayette Station. So click on that, and now this is what is lighting our scene. And we can see this reflective cubed floor now much more easily. So let's make that glossy floor a bit more rough. It kind of offers a bit more diffuse lighting. Great. And what I'm going to do with this environment, actually, I'm going to rotate it a bit. Let's rotate it by 90 degrees, which is going to give us a bit more of an interesting look. So look, now we can offer a little bit of contrast. That's looking nice. All right. So I just want to make these cubes a bit bigger so the gaps between them aren't quite as big. So let's just go, we can do this just in the instance tag. We can make the size multiplier bigger. Let's maybe say 110 or 120. Because we don't really want any gaps until they start moving away from each other. So the final step is, the problem is our eye is directed towards the HDRI because that's the bright point, and we want our eye to be directed towards the splash. So what we're going to do is illuminate from underneath the floor so that the light creeps up from between those cube points. So the way we do that is we need to put a material on our floor connect. I'm just going to take that out of the subdivision surface because we don't need that. Okay, so let's put any object can become a light in Cycles 4D. All you have to do is put an emission material, a material that gives off light. So I'll go to Cycles, Surface, Emission, put this emission material on the floor, and now look, we can see the light popping through. So let's change the color to like that nice electric blue. That's shining through now, and we can increase the strength. So now we only really want the light to pop through where these cubes have been deformed by the wobbly floor. So we need to increase the size still of this size multiplier. Let's bring it up. That's getting better, maybe 140. All right, there we go. So now it's only letting light in where they have opened up this dynamic floor. So just finally, this comes to life when we do a bit of depth of field. So I'm going to bring in a Cycles 4D camera. So before these types of GPU path tracing render engines, getting depth of field was a nightmare because it would turn a 30-second per frame render into a 5-minute per frame render. But now all we need to do is set this up really quickly in Cycles. So I'm going to go to the camera and just pick an area of focus of the splash, go to the Cycles tag, and we're just in the depth of field bit, just bring up the size of this radius. And straight away, we've blurred it out. And I'll add a few more blades to the aperture so we get some bokeh. And then we'll just leave that to clean up a little bit. So pretty quickly, in 20 minutes, we've done a complex fluid splash. We've meshed it. We've created a dynamic floor which moves as it interacts with that splash. And then we've integrated Cinema 4D's MoGraph tools to be able to clone these instances at render time. And very quickly, we've visualized a really, really nice looking render, all done on a laptop. Fantastic. Right, so that's that scene. What I'd like to do is just move on now and show you this one. So this is a simplified version of what you saw in the final render. So what we have here is this really nice advection of colored particles, which then interact with this city geometry, and then we get this nice organic growth of the lights as they spread across our buildings. And again, what's nice about this scene is that it's not faked. It's not that the explosion isn't done, and then the building done, and then cobbled together in post. This is all feeding off each other, this simulation. It's kind of a living and breathing sim. So let's get rid of that. I'll go back to my startup layout. I'm just going to open a new scene. Okay, so what I've got here is just a very simple scene of some city geometry, and it's just some 3 separate city objects in a connect object. So what we're going to do first is spawn our light particles onto this building. So we go to X particles, let's bring in a system again, just to keep organized. And our default emitter, again, is just this square that spits out green particles on the Z axis. But we want to spawn them onto the buildings. So we go to the emitter, to the object tab, which controls its shape. And in the emitter shape, let's change it to object. Then it asks what object do you want to use? Well, we're going to use our building geometry. I'm going to emit from the edges of that geometry. And I can stick the particles to the source so they don't move off that source object. And then in the emission tab, I'm just going to put it to shot, which means it shoots out a certain number on the first frame, and that's it. And let's put loads. Let's put like 50,000 particles. Okay? And then if I go forward a frame, now we're not going to see them that well because they're stuck onto this building, but if I make the building invisible, there we go. So there are our particles for our building. And what we want is for these to be black because the lights are switched off, and we want them to grow on into the color of whatever lights that we want. So in the emitter, instead of birthing them at the default green color, what we can do is change the particle color from green to, let's just take all that color value out. And now we can't see them. They're there. If I just switch off the sky, we've got black particles, but obviously we can't see them because the lights are off. So now what we want to do is we want to grow these on and change their color from black to our lights color. So how do we do that? Well, we use a modifier called Infectio. And what this does, it's really cool. It takes an infected particle and it spreads that infection. And that's all it does. So the way we do it is, it's in a modifier, and it's a control modifier called Infectio. So what we need to do is we need to make some particles infected. None of these particles are infected at the moment. So if I make that building visible and hit play, nothing happens because there aren't any infected particles. There's no infection to spread. So we need to infect the particles first. And the way we're going to do that is we can do it with, I'm first going to show you how to do this with a seed object. So if I bring in a seed object, all it does is bring in this spherical volume. See the yellow spherical volume? And what it does is, any particle that is inside that spherical volume will become infected. So let's just bring it to the edge of our building. Okay? I'll make the building invisible. So I'll go forward one frame. Can you see that the particles inside, now it's hard to see on this screen, isn't it? Let me just change that display mode to squares and then you can see it. There. So all of the particles on the building inside of that have been turned red. So they've become infected. And now we've done that, Infectio can just do its thing. And if I come back and hit play, now Infectio is spreading that infection across those black particles and turning them from blue to red. And there's loads of settings in Infectio which I won't go into now, but if you want to, you can make the infection much quicker, so it spreads up quickly, or you can reduce it way down, so the rate of infection is much slower, and there's an awful lot of control there, which we don't need to go into now. So that's really simple, but we want this to be our lights color, so let's just change it from red to, let's do that nice kind of electric blue color. And I'll just change, actually leave it as is, that's fine. Okay, so there we've got our infection. And that's our lights coming on. That's the basics, but the magic happens a little bit later. So what I'm going to do, we're going to do an explosion now in a separate bit and then join it up later. So this system that we've just done, I'm going to rename it System Infectio. All right? And then we're going to do a new system for our explosion. So I'm just going to switch that one off for now, make it invisible. And let's do a new X particle system. And this one we'll call System Explosion. Okay? And let's just switch off that sky for now. Right. So we need to make our explosion. So I'm going to just bring in a plane as a floor object. Like that. And an explosion requires another dynamics solver. So we're going to go to our dynamics menu, and this time we're not going to do fluid effects because it's not fluids. We're going to use Exposure FX, which is for smoke and fire sims. So let's bring that in. And what it does, it brings in this domain, this cuboid volume. And the smoke and fire sim has to happen within this volume. So we resize it to fit in our scene. And you can see this grid on the back, and what the grid suggests is that the quality level of that simulation. The finer this grid, which is the voxel size, the more detailed and better your explosion is going to look, but it's going to take a lot longer to compute because there's loads more calculations taking place. The beauty with advection, the moving of particles, is that we don't need to render the smoke and fire. We just need to use its shape to push particles around. And as a result, we can have a low quality sim, and the particles will bring out all of the detail. So we can have a really high voxel size, which means we get a nice quick moving simulation for particle advection. So what we're going to do, we're going to get our default emitter. And this emitter, we're actually going to keep it a rectangle this time. And this is going to be this is going to be our fuel source to start our explosion. So I'm going to go to the object. We want it to go on the -z. So it's firing particles towards our buildings. This is going to be our fuel source. So we need to do a couple of things to set this up. We're going to basically set these particles on fire. So we're not going to emit all frames. We're just going to emit for, say, 20 frames, because we just want like a blast. And we don't want full lifespan. We probably want a lifespan of, say, 20 frames with a bit of variation. And we could probably put the speed down a little bit. So let's have a look. Now we have an emission something like that. So we've just got a little spurt of particles. So now we need to give them some fuel to blow up. So we're going to go to extended data, physical data, and look, there's a fuel value. It's given 1 fuel. And the final thing we need to do is we need to give them a tag so this emitter can speak to exposure effects, so it recognizes that they've got fuel. So we go tags, X particles tags, exposure effect source. There we go. And now, there we've got a low resolution smoke splurt. Not quite what we want. We want it to keep going towards the buildings. So I'll just move my emitter a bit closer. So what we can do is in the tag, we can multiply the velocity from those particles into the fluid. So it's going to kind of keep the momentum, but now the buoyancy is letting us down. It's floating up because of the gravitational forces on the various different elements. So look, I'm not going to obviously go through all the exposure effect settings because there are a lot. It's highly complex. But in the simulation, if I just take the gravity out, it's going to remove any of that buoyancy, and it's just going to respect that velocity information. Look, it's moving through our buildings. So that's perfect, just what we want. Okay? Great. I'm just going to make that invisible because we're not rendering this. We're just using that movement to push new particles around. So let's make a new emitter and just copy this one. I'm going to take the tag off because this new one is the one that we're going to see. This is going to be the advected particles. And this new emitter, go to the emission tab, and let's just increase the life of those to about 80. And the birth rate, let's put loads in. Let's put like 50,000. And take the speed off. So now what we've got is a load of particles, but they've just remained static in the emitter because they've got no speed. So we need to tell those particles be pushed around by that exposure effect simulation, okay? And that's called particle advection. And the way we do that is really simple. We go to the exposure effects object, and it's got an advection tab, which is switched off by default. We just switch it on. And all it's saying is, all of these different bits of data that exposure effects generates in its simulations, smoke, burn, temperature, velocity, color, all of that can be passed into any particles it touches. We don't need to pass in any data apart from the velocity, the movement. So we take off the smoke, the burn, the temperature, the color, and the UV. We just want to pass in the velocity. Hit play. Now it's kind of working, but it's kind of blobbed down. What's happened? It looks like we've broken it. And this is a bit of a gotcha, because what has happened is this. The emitter that we're using to create the fire in the first place, that's got the fuel, it's creating the explosion, but then those particles are being advected by the explosion that they've just made, and it's got trapped. So we need to say, don't advect the fuel particles, just advect the particles that we want to move. So all we need to do is go to the emitter in question, to the modifiers, and remember we can exclude stuff. We just exclude the exposure effects advection. And now we will have our proper sim back, and there we go. And you can see even with a really low resolution smoke sim, once we start advecting particles, it brings out this really nice wispy detail. And especially when you start rendering that with like additive materials, it glows in the bits that have more particle density. It starts to look really, really detailed from what is a really cheap sim. So finally, what we're going to do is going to link these two systems now. We want the explosion, to start the infection of our window lights. We don't want to use that seed object. So, what we're going to do is this. Let's reactivate our system with our lights, make the buildings invisible. And what I'm going to do is get rid of that seed object. Remember this, the seed was the spherical volume which initially infected our particles. Because what we're going to say is this is super cool. So remember, we meshed the fluid in the previous scene. We got our particles and meshed them. We can mesh explosions, which is such an amazing thing to be able to do. So what I'm going to do is go to generators, open VDB Mesher, and I'm going to just directly drag in the exposure effects solver into the source. And all you have to do is match the voxel size in the mesher with what your voxel size is in exposure, so it was 8. And now look, we've got a live mesh of that explosion. Now if we wanted to render that mesh, there are ways of making it much higher detail, but we don't. What we're going to do is this. We're going to use a system called questions and actions in xparticles. And what it's going to do is it's going to ask a question every frame. And the black particles are going to say, am I in the volume of that mesher? Yes or no. If the answer is no, nothing happens. If the answer is yes, we're going to make them infected. Okay? Which it sounds more complex than it is. The questions and actions are hugely useful and powerful, and once you get your head around it, very simple. So what we're going to do is this. Let's go to our Infectio system, to the emitter. These are the black particles. And look, I've got a questions tab. Let's bring that up. So I'm going to add a question. And there's loads of preset questions. So we've got question types. There's loads of particle data questions. In particle data, you can ask a question about the age of a particle, the color, the radius, the scale. But we're going to use a particle position question. And the particle position question, there's loads that we can ask, but we're going to ask this inside volume question. Okay? And it's saying, what object do you want me to ask if I'm inside of it or not? So what we need to do is drag in our mesher. Excellent. So the question is now being asked, am I inside this volume, yes or no? And now what we need to do is say, what do you want me to do if I am inside the volume? So we add, that's called an action. So we add an action. And look, we can actually, the action can just be to change what the particles look like to test whether this question's working or not. So if this is working, I'm going to change it to white squares. So if this question is working, when the particles get inside that volume, they should turn white. Let's have a look. So it's asking the question, and there. It's working. As soon as they get inside the volume, they're turning white. Brilliant. So that editor display action is a really good way of testing whether your question's working or not. So let's switch that off because we don't want that, because we want to make them infected. And then Infectio will take over and spread it across the building. So we're going to go to a direct action because we just want them to be infected. And we've got all these preset direct actions that we can change their life. We can kill particles. We can change their color. We can change their size. We can get them to freeze. There's all sorts. But look, we can change Infectio. And the direct change is they will become infected. So if this is working now, we should have our Advection. And where it hits, it should infect them. And then Infectio takes over and spreads that light infection all over our geometry. And that's it, working coherently. And so with a bit of nice rendering, lighting, and a bit of depth of field, we get this fantastic kind of organic growth of lights, which when it's done to the nth degree, you bring it back to this entire cityscape. So you can see some more advection here, exactly the same technique. And then here we have it moving on the city and growing across. So that is just kind of scratching the surface of what some of the really cool visual effects techniques are available within xparticles and how they kind of interact with Cinema 4D scenes, and how relatively simple, once you get your head around the ecosystem, how relatively simple it is to get this happening. There is absolutely loads more that we can show you, but obviously there's just not time to fit it into 50 minutes. So we've got our own INSYDIUM booth in the main hall. We're going to be there all day. X-Particles Master John Bosley is with me as well to answer all the questions that I can't, and would be more than happy to show you loads more stuff throughout the day.